What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about the games that were too much for me, be that difficulty, or I simply found them exhausting to play, or in some cases I was just straight up terrible at them. You see, much of what goes up on the YouTube channel here, as you would probably imagine, are games that I really enjoy, and the genres and things that I have spent a lot of time trying to master, and as a result, what you wind up seeing is a bit of a survivorship bias, if you will. Because what you guys don't see are the games that I go, wow, I'm not good at this, and so I'm probably not going to cover it in full at the very least. And on occasion, I simply think it's fun to talk about those games, if only to remind people there's plenty of things I'm not good at. With all of that said, let's go ahead and actually dive into this thing and talk about some of these. Now let's start in a nice easy spot, as I made this pretty clear in the review itself, and that game is, of course, Ninja Gaiden 4. Now this was an interesting title for me because I have not really kept up with the Ninja Gaiden series at all. Had played some of the original side-scrolling ones when I was a kid, but that was about it. But it's a series that's known for being particularly difficult, and I was then curious to see how that would translate to a modern game, with this most recent title having released just last year. And on one hand, I think it's an incredibly enjoyable action game that is a ton of fun to play if you really enjoy that combat system. However, at the same time, after beating the game on normal, I came to the very quick realization that I was just never going to beat the Master Ninja difficulty, or the highest difficulty. With enough struggling, I could probably do hard mode, but I could tell pretty much immediately that I was just not going to be able to master this combat to a level at which the Master Ninja difficulty really requires, because it's a pretty fast game, and throughout the different levels you'll find yourself on, you have to juggle a lot of different enemies and arenas and things, and on that max difficulty, most things can kill you in 1 to 2 hits. And as quick as the game is, on top of my own sort of middling command over the combat system, it was just not going to happen. But having beat it on normal, I gave it a regular review and simply moved on. But speaking of moving on, let's go ahead and move on to our second game. Now, I really wanted to include this one just because I struggle with this game a lot, and it's also a really funny game to struggle with, and that is none other than Dome Keeper. Dome Keeper is not a complicated game, really. You are essentially trying to protect your dome from aliens as you mine the surface of a planet, having to alternate between fending off waves of those aliens and then of course the actual mining process. And as simple as this game is, I thought it would be a fun little way to kill some time when Raw Fury reached out to me about it. I quickly realized, however, that I am terrible at this game. The gameplay loop is just not something I can get on top of. There is a certain element of knowing when to deep dive into the tunnels that you're digging, to gather the resources, to bring them back, to get your upgrades. You need to fend off the waves. And there's, of course, an in-game timer that will tell you kind of when the incoming waves of aliens are going to happen, that sort of stuff. And it was just a little too many things for me to balance well. Now, it's not a terribly complicated game. If you dig into it, I know what I'm supposed to do. That being things like, of course, managing your exact dig routes in an optimal way, trying to hit the exact type of rock you can get through without taking up extra time, gathering up resources, prioritizing getting that up into the dome, and then of course, focusing on the upgrades you need in an optimal way. I've seen guides and stuff about it, and yet I could just never quite manage to do the thing. And so after only managing to win a single sort of game of Dome Keeper, if you will, a single match, I guess you could call it, on the lowest difficulty, I was like, alright, this is clearly not going to be for me. And so I went ahead and let that one go. But speaking of essentially tower defense games, another sort of deep cut, if you will, and by deep cut I simply mean an older game, we have none other than Orcs Must Die 2. If you're unfamiliar, the Orcs Must Die is essentially a 3D tower defense game. There's about 4 of them, they're fun enough, and as the name would imply, you're trying to kill orcs. The series is still ongoing, it got a full release as recently as last year actually, and the gist of it is, you take control of a character, utilize their abilities, as well as a bunch of traps and things that you will set up along the path the orcs will be taking, and sort of tower defense your way through them with a more active element. Now the catch is, and one of the things I think this particular type of game does really well in comparison to just regular tower defense games, is that it actually makes it somewhat difficult, because while this game is the type of game I would mostly play in the way that I play boomer shooters, which is that, sometimes it's just fun to shoot some stuff, when you get to the sort of end of it and you start redoing the campaign on like nightmare mode as an example, things start to get actually difficult. And it was the campaign on the highest difficulty and the game's endless mode where I realized I was just not going to have it in me to wrap up the rest of it. And I found myself looking for guides on like how to do the endless modes and stuff, and after trying to follow and failing to follow those guides for a while, I pretty quickly realized that it was becoming something that was just not fun to do. And given that I played this back when I was not reviewing games for a living, etc., it was easy enough to just put it down and walk away from it. They are some fun games though if you ever want to give them a try. Second to last, however, I next up want to talk a little bit about Final Fantasy 15. This is an interesting one because it was not any one thing that really got to be overwhelming. It was the combination of a few different things. Now, Final Fantasy 15's like main story and explorable open world is, pretty straightforward enough. Not a terribly difficult experience. Where I started getting annoyed with it was actually with the DLCs as well as the Piteos Ruin, something like that, alongside the multiplayer DLC, where I was just like, alright, I've had enough of this one, I think. Now, by far the worst offender of all those is the multiplayer DLC that they added. It was a sort of co-op DLC that plays very differently from the base game. It's all about running missions with people and then powering up facilities at your sort of base, and it's just not fun, to be honest. Not something I ever really enjoyed playing. I only tried it a little bit, and I was like, wow, this is not for me. And so I knew pretty much immediately after that I was never going to get all the achievements for this because there was no way I was going to play that long enough to do so. But then there's the Piteos Ruins, an incredibly odd parkour dungeon where if you go through all of it, you get this incredible item that makes you very difficult to hit. But the problem with that dungeon is that it's extremely difficult to get through because there's no obvious way to do so. It's just a bunch of like moving objects rotating around that through a lot of trial and error you can find ways to move between, and honestly, if you want to see more, just go look up a guide for it. It's hard to even explain without showing it, but that place was a nightmare. And then the way the game handled its DLC was weird. Now, most of it was fine. The one that I struggled with the most and never actually finished, outside of one I never started, was episode Gladiolus, where you have these like scored trial things. There's 2 achievements for the scores, 500k and 1 million. The 1 million point achievement is still one of the game's rarest achievements, actually. And then there was another DLC, episode Arden, I believe, that I never even started, because at the point that DLC released, I'd already gotten annoyed with the rest of them. But when you combine all those little things together is really what happened with Final Fantasy 15 for me. I enjoyed the main story pretty well, but I think I can safely say that it is rare that a game like this has dropped the ball with the DLC so much to the point that it like actively harmed my opinion of the game. Either way though, all of that stuff together just kind of burned me out on this one, and I decided to stop playing it. And in fact, I still want to play that multiplayer so little that if I ever do wind up actually reviewing 15, it'll just be a regular review. I'm not dealing with all that. Though that does bring us to our final entry. A game I've mentioned once or twice over the years because it's another game that I am pretty bad at, and this is actually Gloomhaven. Now, Gloomhaven, the PC game, is a digital adaptation of the board game Gloomhaven. That's important because, well, I guess you could call it a TRPG. It doesn't quite play like others in the genre because it is intended to play like the board game it is based on. And that includes what, to me, is a very clunky sort of combat system that involves setting up the hand or abilities for individual character types that you bring into dungeons. Now, the catch is you can play 2 of these cards per turn, but only the top half and the bottom half of each card, as there are 2 abilities on the top and bottom half of each. And once you run out of cards, that's kind of just it. It's over. Which means for each encounter, you bring forth so many characters into a fight, and then you use their cards that they have to take out the enemies, and you have to do all of that pretty quickly because once you're out of cards, that's a wrap. You either won or you didn't. And I could just never get on top of this system. It, to me, felt like you had to just play like hyper efficiently, and and I know that's not entirely true. But what winds up happening is I basically just lose over and over and over again, and then I'm like, I don't really want to play this anymore, and so I don't. And so Gloomhaven is one of those games where I can see the appeal for people, but I'm just honestly too bad at it to enjoy it. Which brings us to the end of this video. So, there's been a few games that for one reason or another were a bit too much, but I'd love to hear from you if there's any games you find yourself terrible at, but happen to still enjoy, or just happen to find exhausting, or any other reason you want to throw down there, I guess. By all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.